So, what if you could build an ethical scorecard for politics, using the Gospels as your guide? That is the absolutely fascinating thought experiment we're diving into today. It takes this ancient ethical framework and applies it directly to the really complex world of modern German politics.
And that brings us to the big question, the one at the heart of it all. If Jesus were to cast a ballot in Germany, what would that actually look like? Now, that's a pretty provocative idea, right? And the source material we're looking at answers it, not with some big theological statement, but with a really systematic ethical breakdown.
Okay, so what's so interesting here is that the analysis gives away the ending right at the start. Bam! Here are the results. We see a three-way tie for the top spot with almost 96% alignment. But then, look at that, a huge drop-off for the other parties. So the real question isn't what the result is, it's how in the world did they get these numbers? To figure that out, we got to unpack the whole methodology.
It all starts right here, with the foundation for the entire exercise, the ethical compass. See, before looking at a single political party, the analysis first had to define the principles it was going to judge them by.
And this quote? It is absolutely central to the source's entire analysis. It sets up this core ethical tension. You have to make a choice between prioritizing profit on one hand and prioritizing human well-being on the other. This single idea becomes a key filter for looking at all sorts of economic and social policies.
Now, the source is super clear about its approach. This is not some religious decree. It's a very specific ethical interpretation. It pulls heavily from texts like the Sermon on the Mount, with its focus on mercy and justice, and the cleansing of the temple, which is a big critique of mixing money with public life. This is purely a thought experiment.
So from those texts, the analysis basically boils everything down to these 7 core guidelines. You can think of this as the official scorecard. Every single political position is going to be measured against these principles, from protecting the vulnerable to preserving the environment. This is the whole ethical framework in a nutshell. Okay, so how do you take these big, kind of abstract principles and apply them to actual real-world policies? Well, the analysis came up with 38 specific political questions. It's a lot like one of those voter advice tools you see online. And then it formulated an answer for each one based entirely on that biblical compass we just talked about.
Let's look at a concrete example. On the question of reuniting refugee families, the source's Jesus answer is a very clear no. And this shows the method perfectly. The justification, the why, points directly back to those core guidelines we just saw, things like mercy, compassion, and human dignity.
Okay, how about an economic question, like a wealth tax? The answer here is a conditional yes. You see, the important thing isn't the tax itself, it's the purpose behind it. It's only considered ethically aligned if it actually serves the principle of justice, by reducing poverty and making society a bit fairer. Now, on the environment, the answer to a faster coal phase-out really shows some nuance. It's a yes for the preservation of creation, but, and this is a huge but, it adds the condition, but justly. What that means is making sure that workers and whole communities aren't just left behind. It ties environmental policy directly to social justice.
And what about something really modern, like technology? Facial recognition software? The answer is likely no. And the reasoning argues against building a society based on mistrust. Instead, it says the focus should be on the social causes of crime, putting principles like human dignity and privacy way ahead of total surveillance.
Okay, so we have the ethical principles, and we have the answers to all these specific policy questions. Now we get to see how this all gets crunched into those final scores we saw at the beginning. How exactly do you turn these ethical positions into a number? Well, the source used a really clear 4-step process. First, they came up with the questions. Second, they figured out the ethical answer. Third, and this is the most important part, they compared each political party's actual platform to that answer. They got 1 point for a match, half a point if they kind of matched, and 0 if they totally contradicted it. And then finally, they just added it all up.
But there's one more really crucial detail. Not all issues were treated equally. The analysis actually gave more weight to topics like social justice and peace than, say, transportation policy or digitalization. Why? Because those topics are way more prominent in the Gospels. So the weighting itself reflects the priorities of the ethical framework.
Seeing the numbers like this visually is pretty powerful. Now that we understand the whole method, this chart isn't just showing a result, it's telling a story. It reveals this really profound split between 2 political blocks, all based on how they line up with that 7-point ethical compass.
All right, so this brings us to the final verdict. We've seen the pretty surprising result, we've unpacked the entire ethical framework, and we've followed the scoring. So, what's the ultimate conclusion of this whole thought experiment?
The whole analysis really boils down to this. The ethical standards that were pulled from the Gospels consistently, again and again, prioritize the welfare of those in need, the preservation of the planet, and a pretty deep critique of pure profit-seeking.
And, when you think about it, that conclusion leads directly to the results we saw. The parties that ended up scoring the highest were the ones whose official programs most closely matched these core priorities: social justice, climate protection, and solidarity. The final math simply reflects the stated values.
Finally, it is absolutely essential to end where the source itself ends, with a very clear disclaimer. The authors really stress that this entire project is hypothetical. It's an ethical exercise. It is explicitly not a voting recommendation, but instead an exploration of what happens when you apply a consistent value system to the world of politics.
And that really leaves us with a bigger question, one for you to think about. This explainer looked at one very specific ethical framework, but it kind of challenges all of us to think about our own. No matter where your values come from, what are the core principles that you believe should guide our politics? It's definitely a question worth thinking about.